At Zhangzhou Airport, a white plane was coming in for landing. Despite the good weather, everything was tense: the people, the atmosphere. Today, the most famous warrior, Su Zi, was arriving in the city. No one knew who he was or what he looked like. The man who met him at the airport was nervously tugging at his tie nasib, trying to get more air than possible. Large drops of sweat trickled down from his forehead, falling behind his collar and tickling his skin uncomfortably. It was Zhang Dingfa, the richest man in Zhangzhou. The crowd of men looking at him were also starting to get nervous. They looked at each other and whispered to each other, trying to figure out who they were meeting. Su Zi even had an entire airport shut down for this purpose, but apparently not everyone was brought up to speed. The man who greeted them shouted furiously at them that such important information needed to be known. He exhaled angrily and told the confused crowd that their guest had won many battles and was the only Deviatisvia's Dakinim 9-star war god in the country. He is also called the Dragon Marshal. One of the men doubted this information, but the greeter quickly closed his mouth, threatening him with violence and punishment for disobedience. The plane finally landed, and the men saw a snow-white ramp on which a man was standing. Theringer greeted him, calling him Dragon Marshal respectfully, and introduced himself as Zhang Dingfa. One of the soldiers who accompanied him looked at the crowd and said that they didn't need to be here anymore. Indeed, no one else emerged from the plane. The two men shrugged their shoulders in disbelief and dispersed. It turned out that the Dragon Marshal was already out of the plane. A handsome young man named Su Zi was standing by the side of the road. He held a crumpled piece of paper in his hands. It was a note from his deceased brother, in which he wrote who was responsible for his death. It was Zhang Kai and Lin Miao. The young man tightened his grip on the paper and vowed to take revenge for his brother. He was distracted by one of the soldiers, who called the Dragon Marshal into the car of Commander Lai from Jiangzhou. He agreed without hesitation and went to the car. He approached a yellow military vehicle. Commander Lai rose in greeting to shake his hand and called him Dragon Marshal, but Su Zi angrily stopped him, sharply telling him not to call him that anymore. The commander gave a startled bow and quickly nodded his head, apologizing for his carelessness. Wanting to make amends, he asked if there was anything he could do to help the great warrior now. Su Zi abruptly placed the same note from his brother on the table and sternly informed him that he needed to know where the two people listed on the note were. Commander Lai replied that Zhang Kai and Lin Miao, who his brother had written about, would be attending the banquet at Sun's mansion tonight. It will see the Sun's group takeover banquet group, and there will be famous people present, including these two. The young man grinned and said that then he would definitely attend this banquet as well. The crowd of soldiers cheered his words. At this time, Zhang Kai and Lin Miao were happily making love in the Dingfa Hotel. Their passionate screams could be heard even in the next room behind the wall. Zhang Kai looked into Krasavy, the girl's beautiful eyes, and was satisfied that she was finally completely his. With a devilish smile, he recalled how Pajiv, that idiot Zhang's son, had died. He never realized that his beloved girlfriend and his property were now strangers to the unfortunate man. Zhang Kai assured Lin Miao that they would now have a bright future and a rich inheritance. All of a sudden, the door to the suite opened and his assistant walked in with some important news for them. Zhang Kai angrily asked her what she wanted right now at such a crucial moment. The assistant said resignedly that the Postlukayu Pokapki Company Dragon Marshal himself would be arriving for today's banquet on the occasion of the purchase of the company. The man almost choked on his wine and quickly left to get dressed, saying that he needed to properly prepare for the meeting. He didn't expect that a great man like Marshall would grant them such an honor and personally come to the banquet himself. This is probably a good chance to show yourself in front of him. Already sitting in the car, Zhang Kai gazed dreamily out the window and imagined how his family would end up on top of the world, interacting with a person like Dragon Marshal. Suddenly, the car jerked and braked sharply. The assistant, who was driving, made excuses and pointed to an unknown old man who blocked the road, not allowing the car to pass. Zhang Kai jumped out of his car in a rage and Gronko yelled loudly at the unfortunate old man. The latter responded by grabbing him by the collar of his expensive jacket and telling him that he was to blame for the death of his unfortunate son. The man was startled and his companion, Lin Miao, recognized this old man as Zhang Zun's foster father, the guy they had destroyed. Angrily, Zhang Kai shoved away the old man who was beside himself with grief and fell right into the road. The man's lordnim told him with a malicious laugh that even if he knew the truth, he couldn't Ikomu prove anything to anyone. After which, he and Lin Miao left, casting a disgusted glance at the unfortunate man. The guards stationed at the entrance approached the old man with batons in their hands, but he didn't even move. They swung at him, but suddenly, a dragon marshal appeared out of nowhere. He grabbed the batons and apologized to his uncle for coming here too late. The old man couldn't believe his eyes. This slender young man looked like someone very familiar. His smile confirmed that the old man wasn't mistaken in recognizing him. With a light movement, he knocked the heavy batons out of the guards' hands and Sammy, they fell to the ground by themselves. The old man watched it all with pleasure and thought with satisfaction that now his adopted son would be avenged. My brother finally returned. Souza finished with the guards and went to the beautiful mansion where the banquet was already starting. The crowd of rich and well-dressed people watched him go with a puzzled look, probably thinking that he was some beggar who had come to eat and drink for free. Suzi's clothes were tattered and he really looked like a tramp. However, he didn't care at all. Mr. Zhang's assistant, Uznalab Incidents Akronoi, immediately reported the incident to her supervisor after learning about the security incident. He just grinned, showing that he wasn't interested. There was nothing to worry about. Suze was only a common soldier who left on his wedding day 3 years ago. It is unlikely that it will cause them unnecessary problems. Zhang Kai decided to go down and meet him in person. When he saw the guy, he called out his name. He nodded without turning around. Zhang Kai decided to test his strength and began to hurt him with offensive words. He reminded him about the failed wedding, about serving in the army, about the attitude of people to his actions. Suzy Spokueno listened calmly and turned around abruptly to meet his gaze. There was something in his eyes that scared Zhang Kai. But he checked himself just in time. He, who was respected by the Dragon Marshal, did not need to be afraid of Soldier. He decided to find out why he had come here and guessed that it was because of Zhang Sun's case. Zhang Kai mockingly informed him that, after taking over the leadership of Sun's group, the business would finally begin to flourish. Then he was called to speak at the banquet and left. While introducing the guests, he decided to also make fun of Suzy and introduced him to the people around him. No one present had seen the face of the Dragon Marshal, so they didn't recognize this simple and ordinary guy as a great warrior. There were giggles, and some people started discussing Suzy, remembering his abandoned wife and murdered brother. Lin Miao walked up to him and sarcastically asked him what he was going to do. Suzit only snapped back, and the girl warned him not to even dare to ruin their day and make a fuss about Zhang Sun. Zhang Kai hurried to calm her down and offered the guy a thick and large wad of money. There were 30,000 yuan that he could live on for a whole year if Suzy was an ordinary person. But Mr. Zai made one condition. The guy had speeches to say out loud that he was a loser right now. The crowd of people took up his words and laughingly offered to add money so that the loser could also dance. The situation was only getting worse. Lin Miao was watching the guy's reaction carefully, but he was completely unfazed. She wanted him to get angry so she could set the guards on him. Suzy carefully looked at everyone and sternly asked if everyone was laughing. His eyes radiated a strange red color, and the surprised crowd quieted down. Souza finally started to speak, but shouts from the crowd interrupted him, shouting insulting nicknames and demanding to get out of here. However, Zhang Kai stopped the shouting with a single gesture out of curiosity, and Lin Miao angrily ordered the guy to speak while this gentleman gave his word. There was a wooden chair on the stage, and Suzy immediately sat down on it. Everyone around them gasped in surprise and insolence. This chair was meant for the Dragon Marshal, and no one was allowed to sit there. There were more shouts, and Zhang Kai demanded that he vacate a seat that didn't belong to him. After thinking about it, the guy refused and said that he sat down where he needed to, because he is the Dragon Marshal. Of course, no one believed him, and a roar of derisive laughter filled the room. People thought he was crazy or out of his mind after the service. How could an entity like Suzy earn such a title? Lin Mio Miao rushed over to pull him out of the chair and was immediately slapped hard as soon as she touched him. She screamed, jumped back, and looked at him in horror, not understanding how he could have hit her. Suzy calmly informed her that this slap was revenge for his late brother. The girl wanted to protest, but immediately received a second slap in the face for colluding with Zhang Kai. No one said a word, and everyone watched in silence as he slapped her a few more times, saying the reasons behind it, insulting Zhang Sun's father, embezzling the company, etc. Lin Mio Miao screamed and fell to the floor, writhing in pain. Her cheeks were flushed like red roses. He wiped his hands on a handkerchief and turned to Zhang Kai, who was glaring at him. He didn't understand how this guy had the audacity to treat his girlfriend like this, and shouted at the guards to kick this loser out. However, the guy also dealt with them with lightning speed, using the wooden chair next to him. Zhang Kai then drew his dagger and charged at him. It was a pointless attempt that didn't succeed at all, and a minute later, Zhang Kai was also on the floor. Suzy leaned over him and looked into his eyes, then stabbed the blade into his leg, right in the thigh area. He screamed in pain and saw a bloodstain spreading across his trousers. Suzy took another look at everyone present and reported that he only had one goal. Zhang Kai was supposed to be kneeling at Zhang Sun's grave in 5 days when the guy came there. He'd also decided to change his name from Dragon Marshal to God of War instead. After informing the crowd in surprise, Suzy turned around and left. Zhang Kai only shouted curses after him, gritting his teeth in pain. The guy left and didn't even look back at the angry shouts of the man and the whole crowd. Suzy walked down the dark street, thinking about his brother. He had no doubt that he would avenge his death. Suddenly, a car horn sounded. It was President Zhang, the one who was waiting for the Dragon Marshal at the airport. His companion, sitting next to him, asked who he saw there. But the man just waved it off. They were heading to a rich party because of the president's big purchase, and were supposed to meet the great warrior, the Dragon Marshal, there. When Zhang Dingfa arrived, he gave everyone instructions on how to behave in front of the Dragon Marshal, and strictly warned that no one would annoy him or dare to cross him. However, when they entered, all they saw was a battered Zhang Kai being led by 2 guards. He was shot in the leg and looked exhausted. The newly arrived guests looked at him in surprise. It seemed that this was some kind of joke or mockery of famous people. There was no sign of the Dragon Marshal or any other important guests. Indeed, it was unlikely that such a great warrior would have come to this modest party where no one was present. President Zhang became angry and grabbed his son Zhang Kai, demanding to know what had happened. The young man explained that Suzy had come and caused such a mess. The president, in a rage, promised to find him and make a merry life so that this upstart would not dare to behave like this to them. Suzy, meanwhile, continued his nighttime walk. He stopped in front of a coffee shop, and then the memories of the past came flooding back to him. He remembered Howie Kaladnoy. As a boy, he had frozen and starved to death here, under the cafe's windows, one harsh and cold winter. Then the boy almost gave up, but someone appeared who changed his whole life and did not let him die. Then he was able to buy food with a precious coin. It was impossible to forget. That bun was as delicious as it ever was. His assistant called out to him, snatching him out of the clutches of his memories and telling him that they had found the man who had saved him. It was Yun Tani, and she was the first beauty in Janzhou. But the strangest thing was that she was the same girl he married 3 years ago when he joined the army. It turned out that his legal wife is the very girl he was looking for so long, remembering the taste of that steamed bun. How inexplicable it was that he had left his wife for the same girl she was. What a turnaround! He was very surprised and shocked. But who is she? What does she look like? And what is she doing now? There was an urgent need to find out, and Suze found out from aides that she was attending the Yun family leader's birthday party today. He had to find the best gift for this beautiful woman. After all, she was his wife. He also expected to change into something nice himself and instruct his assistants to change into better and new clothes. When they arrived at the party, the birthday girl was just being presented with expensive gifts from various serious people. Directors, chairmen, businessmen. The elderly woman was very happy with the holiday that was arranged for her. Suddenly, her bodyguard turned around and shouted at someone who appeared unexpectedly. At the same time, Suzy appeared next to the woman with an interesting gift in his hand. This guy hadn't been noticed before because he was dressed in a normal soldier's uniform and didn't attract any attention. It was strange for a rich party to have such a choice of weekend clothes for a man. Everyone turned to look at the unexpected guest and wondered why he was wearing a soldier's uniform. The woman's grandson also looked at Suzy in surprise. One of the relatives greeted him happily, but then stopped because an elderly woman tapped her stick on the floor. She disdainfully asked why this useless trash was here, and her grandson, to support her, laughingly replied that the guy probably came for a free meal. The crowd immediately roared as they recognized Suzy and started discussing him and his actions. They said That probably did not cope with the service and decided to return to the care of relatives. The grandson came over and asked if Suzy had brought a present because he was here for his birthday. The woman gave the boy a stern look. The guy nodded and showed them a small, beautiful box that contained a gift. He opened it and wished happiness to the clan elder, giving him a gift. The woman was surprised and looked inside with interest. There was an old bowl with a broken piece on it, and everyone was buzzing again with surprise at seeing such a strange gift. The crowd felt that it was indecent to give such a simple thing to a bloodline elder. The grandson said with a laugh that Suzy probably brought this bowl for himself to put in the food that he would ask for at the banquet. He asked the old woman not to be angry, because it could harm her health and condition. He turned to Suzy and indignantly asked why he was giving such broken things instead of a normal gift. The boy protested that the bowl wasn't broken and that it was a worthy gift for the elder. The relatives again decided to ask if it was an antique, to which he again shook his head and shrugged. Then the grandson pulled out his present and asked the grandmother to calm down and accept his normal gift. When he unfolded it, it turned out to be a beautiful painting drawn by a famous artist. Probably a lot of money was spent on this gift. The grandmother was immediately happy and took the picture, noting the love and care of her grandson. He said sheepishly that he was glad she liked it. The second grandchild came up and also announced the gift. The guy clapped his hands and a large cardboard box was brought into the yard. It turned out to be an old, beautiful blue vase, painted with incredible patterns. It was the master's skillful work. Then other relatives started coming over, also carrying expensive gifts to honor the Yun family elder. The woman was very happy and thanked everyone for their excessive care. The gifts also included jade ornaments that looked great and looked very expensive. The grandchildren looked at each other and said with pleasure that they were the happiest of people because they could afford it. However, someone remembered Suzy and Yu's useless gift. It seemed to them that the guy was the only one who shamed their family with his appearance and strange gifts. But suddenly, Suzy took the floor and said that he didn't want to upset the Yun family's guests and relatives, but all the gifts they gave were fake. Everyone looked at each other in dismay. One of the relatives suggested that probably the young man is jealous that they brought gifts better than him and therefore says such nonsense. Just as Suzy opened his mouth, a woman's angry cry rang out and a beautiful young woman appeared on the doorstep. Their eyes met, and he knew it was his wife. His hands trembled, and the beauty's eyes filled with tears. She started to say something to him, but he interrupted her and said that he had come back to give her back the life she had lost, and now she would be the happiest woman in the world. She pushed him away and told him that his intentions were known from the broken bowl that he gave to the elder. Her relatives immediately supported her and also said that they did not see the sincerity in his actions. Suzy looked back at them in confusion. He didn't understand why there was such a reaction to his gift. My grandmother was tired of looking at all this, and she was indignant that today should be a joyful day, and let the garbage take itself out. She kicked the guy out, but he still left his gift on the other boxes, and thought that he still hoped for respect from the elder. As he passed his beloved, he whispered in her ear that she should trust him and left the house with a confident step. Young Channy looked after him and thought that he didn't look the same as before, and he also spoke in a completely different way. It was strange, to say the least. Was it really her husband, Suzy? Suzy walked out to the street, where a car was waiting for him. The assistants were surprised that the Yun family elder didn't accept the gift since it was so expensive. The guy was sure that this family simply did not appreciate the gift because of their limited horizons. One of the aides informed him that the governor from a nearby city to the southwest, Yi, wanted to host a welcome banquet. Suzy was not in the mood, so he ordered his assistant to go to the banquet instead. He agreed with surprise, and they continued on their way. When he asked where to go, Suzy decided to head home to his wife, who was currently on a holiday. And in the Yun household, they were still discussing the boy's strange gift and making caustic remarks to his wife. They were still offended that Suzy had only brought a broken plate and dared to accuse them of forging expensive gifts. They thought that he was still the same uneducated and uncouth soldier that he left. My wife just listened to this and was silent, looking at the floor. She was ashamed and didn't understand what he had done either. Suddenly, someone called out to them and asked about the bowl they were discussing. It was Mr. Kang, the best antique appraiser in town. This old man could determine the value of a commodity just by looking at it with his fiery eyes. The elderly female elder Yun was very surprised when she saw him and asked why he didn't warn her of his arrival. She could have welcomed him in person if she'd known he'd be at the party. She pointed at the mountain of gifts given by her grandchildren and asked the old man to check them out, to which he happily agreed. The grandchildren looked at each other in fear, knowing that something was about to happen. One of the relatives intervened, who decided to dissuade the appraiser from checking the gifts, assuring that such a trifle was not worth his attention. The crowd roared when he called these expensive gifts small change. The woman glared at him angrily and ordered him not to disturb the appraiser and stop panicking. The first gift to be checked was a painting given by one of the grandchildren. The old man looked at it carefully, then let out an angry sigh and said that it was only a fake that didn't cost more than 1,000 yuan. The woman was taken aback. All the other gifts that Mr. Kang checked were also cheap fakes bought at the bazaar. The crowd of guests roared in disapproval as they discussed the Yun family's relatives had treated their grandmother so meanly on her birthday. The woman was confused and didn't know what to do. One of the grandchildren decided to defuse the situation and apologize to the woman for not checking the gifts before buying at the antique market. She chuckled, but she was upset that a big man like Mr. Kang had to see this disgrace. The old man was about to leave when Suzy's wife remembered her husband's words when he asked her to trust him. She understood what he meant and called out to the old appraiser, informing him that there was another gift that he hadn't looked at. Everyone around them laughed at the thought of the broken cup. It was ridiculous to stop the old man for such a small matter. The grandchildren were outraged, demanding not to upset Mr. Kang, who had already seen a lot at the festival, but the girl insisted on her own. The old man came back and walked over to her. The young woman was holding a small box. Mr. Kang froze in surprise and just stood there, frozen. One of the grandchildren came up and said it was just some beggar's old bowl and there was no need to worry about it. The old man glared at him angrily and said that it was actually a small bowl with purple spots that was only used by the imperial family and was very expensive. He shook his head, looking around at all his relatives in confusion. They looked at him in disbelief and resolutely refused to understand that Suzy had actually given an expensive and good gift. Mr. Kang said that this bowl was sold at auction and cost about 100 million. One of the grandchildren doubted the appraiser's competence. No one could believe that an ordinary soldier had such expensive things. The old man became angry and looked resentfully at the impudent youth. The appraiser approached the woman and asked where she got such an expensive item, because this item can only be obtained by the elite. The grandmother replied sheepishly that this gift was given to her by her great son-in-law, and he had already left the party. Mr. Kang was upset that he couldn't see the former owner of this bowl and told him to cherish this rare item. The relatives whispered among themselves and collectively decided that this poor man was just lucky to get this thing. Only Yun Chanyi closed her eyes and breathed a sigh of relief when she realized that Sai Wuze, her beloved husband, had not deceived her this time. She understood the words of trust he had spoken to her. The car was driving on the highway, leaving the Yun family's party. At the wheel was Yun Tanyi's father, Ru Chen, and next to him was his young wife and the girl's mother, Chai Lanfi. An angry mother told her daughter that she absolutely needed to divorce Suzy. She couldn't understand why this guy had gone into hiding for 3 years in the service, and now he had appeared so abruptly and so spectacularly, shaming their family at the party. His father just gave an approving grunt and said that Suzy was now more ready for marriage than ever. The mother got angry and started explaining that if he left such a thing, worth 100 million in the family, they could sell it and live as they want. She continued to fight with her daughter and demand a divorce from this loser who was of no use to her. The girl didn't say anything, just turned away from her parents and stared out the window all the way. When they got home, her mother was still grumbling. The father once again tried to calm his wife down and asked her to enter the house. As they approached the door, the family could smell the smell coming from the other side of the door. It smelled extremely good, and the woman impatiently headed inside. When they opened the lock, they saw that their dining table was set. There were 4 plates on it. It was very strange. If they were robbers, it was unlikely that they would prepare delicious food for them to meet them from the road. Yun Chanyi seems to have guessed what's going on here. Suddenly, they saw Suzy, who was wearing an apron with a satisfied look, and a snow-white smile was shining on his face. The young wife screamed in fright. She did not understand how he got here and why he came. There was a password on the door, and it was difficult to find out, or rather, even impossible. Suzy with a smile, he said that he remembered the time when he lived here. The woman chuckled, and the whole family sat down at the table. The guy made duck soup with carrots, which was so delicious that all the resentments seemed to be dispelled. Only Yun Tanyi occasionally glanced at her husband. The girl's mother asked why he was able to make such a delicious meal, and Suzy only smiled sheepishly. Then he got up and took out a bottle of expensive liquor from behind the sofa, which he decided to share with his wife's father. The man appreciated the taste and was very satisfied with this treat, even though Suzy didn't tell him that this liquor had been in an ancient tomb before. After taking care of everyone, the young man fixed his gaze on his wife, who was looking thoughtfully into the distance. She was thinking about what made Shidazi change and how he suddenly became so good to them, but incomprehensible to everyone else. She was distracted by her mother, who reminded her about going to a restaurant tomorrow and that the girl would have to go with her. She did not give the reason, and the girl did not ask her. Chai Lanfi got up from the table and announced that she was going to go to bed and advised the girl to do the same. Then she turned to Suzy and sternly said that if he regretted not being here for the past 3 years, he should bring her that broken bolto keep in their house. Suzy wanted to say something, but his father took his wife by the shoulders and reassured her that the gift for you is at grandma's and she needs it more, especially since it was given from the bottom of her heart. The woman pouted and turned away. Suzy told his wife that she could rest while he cleared the plates and cutlery from the table, but Yun Chanyi's icy heart was hard to melt. She angrily told the guy that she knew that the marriage would end in a month. It was arranged by her grandfather, and she would only allow Suzy to stay here for 1 month before the divorce. After that, she added that no matter what he did or what efforts he made, they would divorce in a month. Suzy smiled. He didn't seem moved by her words at all, and he was determined. He proudly declared that he would make her fall in love with him in a month, and then they wouldn't have to divorce because he was worthy of her love. She pushed him away and confidently told him that everything had already been done and said before, and he should look for a suitable job during this time, so that he could move out and support himself. Then she pointedly turned around and left. The guy smiled again and looked after her. She didn't seem to have changed much since the last day they'd met, only now she seemed unsure of what she was saying. But he would still get his way, and she would fall in love with him, that was for sure. The next morning, the mother was already knocking on her daughter's door. She opened the door after a while and asked why they had decided to wake her up so early, because it was her day off. Her mother angrily replied that it was no longer bedtime and ordered her to quickly clean up and dress nicely so that she could be sent to the restaurant with her, as agreed yesterday. Yun Tianyi didn't know why they were going there, since the food in the restaurant was very expensive and they couldn't afford it. They never went to such expensive places. At this, the woman hesitated and then happily informed her daughter that she would have a date with a rich man there. The daughter was very surprised because she was married and there was no need for her to look for someone other than Suzy. The mother confidently declared that he was not a match for her because he had not achieved anything, and the guy she wanted to introduce her to was very rich and influential, recently returned from abroad. My mother seemed only interested in money and status. She reported with an unhealthy glint in her eyes that the family fortune of this guy, Chu Dior, was $1 billion, and he was clearly better than her penniless and worthless current hubby. She also said that because of this failed marriage, their father had lost his position in his family, and if they didn't have proper support, then their uncle would deprive them of everything. They were completely dependent on their relative's decision. Her daughter started to protest, but her mother shouted sharply at her to get dressed and told her sternly to stop asking stupid questions. Yun Tianyi sighed and 10 minutes later appeared in front of her mother in a cute blue outfit that showed off all her curves. The mother noted with admiration that it was not for nothing that her daughter took after her mother and became a real beauty. Then she went downstairs, calling out that she was waiting for her daughter in the car. The girl sighed. Even though she was an adult, she was never allowed to make her own decisions. Suddenly, a familiar male voice rang out from behind. It was her husband, Suzy. He offered his wife a delicious porridge, which he had just prepared, and the girl became very sad. She told him that he didn't have to do nice things for her, because they would be separated in a month anyway, and all this effort was in vain. The guy objected that everything would be as he said. He would win her favor, no matter what the cost, and make her the happiest girl on the planet. The girl stared at him for a moment and blushed, but then she came to her senses and said she was hungry. She took the porridge from the young man's hands and went to taste it. While she ate, the guy looked at her with admiration, and when she finished, he asked her how she liked his food. She nodded contentedly, but immediately said that you don't need to be a domestic husband to please her. You need to be able to earn a name for yourself, and then he can compete with other men. After which she stood up and, with a slight sad smile, told him again not to waste his time. Suzy laughed and said that he could meet her needs in whatever way she wanted. She blushed when he started to wipe her mouth with a napkin and pushed his hand away in fright. After that, she got up from the table and headed for the exit, saying that she was leaving. Suddenly, she had a great idea. She asked if her husband had any plans for the day, and when the answer was no, she invited him to a restaurant with her. What a surprise for your mother! Together they went out to the street, where the mother was sitting in the car, waiting impatiently for her daughter to get ready. When she saw Susan next to her, she glared at her daughter and asked what he was doing here. Yun Tianyi, as if she didn't understand anything, said that she had invited him to a restaurant for lunch. The mother looked at her daughter in surprise and asked if she really wanted to make trouble by asking her husband out on her own date. Hearing that word, Suzy stopped dead in his tracks. The girl indignantly replied that the whole city knew about her engagement. The guy breathed a sigh of relief. Apparently, this date was not at the will of the girl and her mother forced her. My mother resigned herself and decided to go to the restaurant. She hoped that Suzy would quickly get tired of sitting with them and not want to continue, and they would be able to get rid of him. Moreover, everyone in the city knew the guy, and the attitude towards him was not the best. They quickly arrived at the restaurant, and the mother shushed her daughter to make a pretty face and not make faces as usual. The woman opened the door and smiled pleasantly. There was no one else at the table but Joe Dior, her daughter's chosen man. He immediately said hello and introduced himself. This came as a complete surprise to the girl. The woman thanked him for waiting, and the man convinced her that it was not necessary because he had just arrived. When he saw Suzy, he assumed that it was Yun Tianyi's younger brother and also greeted him politely. The guy objected that he was mistaken, and he was not the girl's brother, but her legal husband. The woman, who saw the confusion in Joe Dior's eyes, said that her daughter married him at the behest of her grandfather, and in a month they can finally divorce, which she is very much waiting for. Joe Dior was very surprised. The mother whispered to the chosen one to try to humiliate Suzy so that he would understand the difference between them. Meanwhile, Suzy carefully sent a mensajito, his assistant, to find out information about this strange person sitting across from him. The chosen one approached him and demanded that he stop going through the phone, as he finally had a chance to stay in such a beautiful and elite restaurant. He continued that he had heard a lot about him and how he left his wife and joined the army 3 years ago. He said this with such mockery that anyone in Suzy's position would have exploded long ago, but not him. But the guy calmly replied that he retired a year ago. Joe Dyer replied that he thought so, that he had achieved nothing and remained an ordinary soldier, and if he had recently returned to the city, then he probably hadn't found a good job yet. Continuing to mock, he suggested that the guy was going to live off his wife's family, which was a very bad decision, and laughed. The girl could not stand it and interrupted their conversation, because she was tired of listening to these insults. She asked them to stop and finally make an order. They still came to lunch at the restaurant. The chosen one just grunted and promised Suzy to prove the huge difference between them anyway. Everyone sat down at the table in silence, and Joe Dyer snapped his finger to call out to the man. At the same time, a waitress who was very cute walked up to them with a quick step, a girl with big curves. She asked them what they would like, but for some reason in Spanish. The woman and her daughter looked at each other, not understanding what she said. The chosen one reassured them that in such elite places many people serve in Spanish because it is prestigious. The woman was confused because none of them knew this language. To which the man replied that he knew the language perfectly well, because he often went to Spain with his father. He ordered caviar, steaks, and wine for himself, 2 steaks, and a salad for the woman and her daughter, and nothing for Suzy. He decided to make fun of him and deliberately threw the menu at him, knowing that he wouldn't be able to say anything in Spanish. He needed to humiliate the guy even more, and he was looking at him with a sardonic grin. Joe Dyer asked why he didn't order anything, and maybe he didn't like the menu. The woman laughed and said that he didn't understand the menu anyway, so he just sat there looking at the list in silence. But at the same time, Suzy ordered broccoli and foie gras in pure Spanish, which surprised even the waitress. Then he added more mushroom soup and caviar, to which the waitress was surprised to say that his Spanish was as good as that of native speakers. Joe Dyer was in complete shock and didn't understand anything. How could this redneck know Spanish? Suzy said with a smile that he had learned it in a month and it wasn't too difficult. The waitress gasped in surprise and said that he had a real talent for learning such a language so quickly. She started speaking Chinese and said that Joe Dyer started a dialogue with her in Spanish, so she continued to serve them in that language. Suzy laughed because he realized that the chosen one's attempt to stand out was not successful. Joe Dyer became enraged at his words and angrily slammed his fist down on the table. The woman reassured him that knowing Spanish didn't mean anything to them yet, and that he was still as insignificant to her as ever. She pushed the chosen one to say a few words to her daughter, Yuntani. He straightened up, straightened his tie, and told the girl that he had waited 2 years for this moment to meet her, because he had loved her so much and suffered for her. At the same time telephone, a reply came to Chen Su's phone from his assistant, who found out everything about the chosen one. The guy picked up the phone and smiled. There was something interesting and very intimate there. The girl was confused by his words and assumed that this was some kind of nonsense, even though they hadn't even had a drink Nichkoyet. Joe Dyer flared up and shouted that his heart was constantly hurting because of the thought of her, and he missed her so much, so one and only for him. Suzy chuckled and said that there was indeed an illness, but it wasn't because of love for Yuntani. This is a hidden disease that does not need to be told, and it does not concern the heart at all, but something lower. The chosen one looked at him in bewilderment with frightened eyes. Suzy asked him if he didn't understand anything. After all, he is tormented by pain in the lower back, knees, and other charms that interfere with normal life. Joe Dyer resolutely refused these words, showing by his appearance that he did not understand what he was talking about. Suzy then decided to escalate the attack and asked how often he urinated in the middle of the night and woke up in a cold sweat. The chosen one stood in horror and did not know where to go from shame. Finally, he forced out that these problems were all due to the heavy workload and nerves at work and school. Suzy laughed and went on to say that the Chosen One's job is probably to provide services of a strange nature or to learn a language. He looked at his phone and said that yesterday the man had a date with 2 girls and he finished his business in just 5 seconds, which was very shameful. Finally, deciding to finish him off, he said that he was suffering from premature ejaculation and he should take care of his health to avoid other health problems. Joe Dyer was furious and asked why he wouldn't leave Yun Tiny alone. After all, he had abandoned her back when he joined the army 3 years ago. Suzy was determined and replied that he had only left to provide his wife with the good life she deserved. Then he turned to her and told her that she was the person he loved most in the world. Yun Tany was embarrassed and told him to stop talking right now and sit at the table for lunch. The guy immediately stopped arguing and smiled as he sat down at the table, obeying his wife. The table Nuyat Naya fell uncomfortably silent. The Chosen One was thinking about how this simpleton was able to find out so much about him and how he got into his medical history, which no one knew about except his attending doctors. My mother sat over the appliances and tried to figure out how to use them properly so as not to embarrass herself in front of anyone. Joe Dyer didn't give up and still wanted to make a fool of this upstart. He looked at the musician who was sitting at the piano and performing a beautiful piece. With a smile, he asked if Suzy liked the music that the musician was currently playing. The guy looked at him and Soglasno nodded in agreement. Hoping that he had caught him, the Chosen One asked if the young man knew the name and author of this music. The young man replied with a smile that it was a toast, and the name was A Dream of Love. After that, he looked at Joe Dyer questioningly and fell silent, but the latter didn't show any reaction. Suzy then decided to answer and said that since Mr. Dyer was so fond of music, he would also give him a chance to guess a little. He got up and walked over to the musician. He asked the man's permission to play his piano so that he could perform the piece. The musician agreed and the guy sat down in his place. The girl, who had been watching her husband all this time, was very surprised to see him at the piano. Joe Dyer laughed and said that maybe her husband had had too much and was going to throw a party. But when Suzy started playing, there was silence. Pleasant music poured out of the instrument, striking everyone around, and guests involuntarily turned around to look at the musician who played the piano so beautifully. Only Yun Tany, sadly, she thought that it looked like her husband had gone through a lot in that time to learn all this, and who knows what made him do it. The music stopped and the guests clapped their hands in delight. She smiled at Suzy and noticed that he was a great piano player. Only the mother sat with a disgruntled face and thought that all this was a trick to show off in front of them and did not affect the situation in any way. The guy sat down at the table and asked Joe Dyer what kind of music he had just performed. The Chosen One's hands began to shake. He was sweating, and then he assumed that this was a rhapsody on a theme of Paganini. Of course, that was the wrong answer. This man didn't know anything about music at all. But the Chosen One did not give up and continued to tell his guesses. He called Mozart, and it was the wrong answer again. After seeing the man give up, Suzy confessed that he had just composed this piece on the spot, and a man like Joe Dyer deserved a fair assessment of his bragging, because he didn't know anything about music. Not knowing what to do next, the Chosen One decided to offer Suzy a drink with him, to which the guy replied with a chuckle, "Does he really want to be humiliated by him again?" Joe Dyer angrily said that he just wanted a drink and nothing more, and Suzy nodded in agreement. He called the waiter, from whom he had ordered 10 bottles of cognac, and who brought them, and placed them on the table in front of them. The men began to drink, glancing at each other from time to time, and drank until 2 out of 10 bottles of cognac were left on the table. The girl was indignant and ordered them to stop drinking, to which Suzy noticed that the Chosen One really had enough to drink through force. Joe Dyer, who had been drinking heavily, said that he was still able to drink, but at the same moment he had a fit of vomiting, which he could not contain. The contents of their stomachs spilled out of their mouths like a fountain, and everyone's lips curled in disgust. Turning away, he wiped his lips and glared at Suzy, who was sitting there as if nothing had happened. It seemed that there was no way to beat him at anything, and this really infuriated the man. "How can you break through it?" From impotence, tears appeared in the eyes of the chosen one. He drank too much, and because of this, no doctor wanted to take on his treatment because it would be useless. Yesterday, he actually met two foreign beauties and disgraced himself for spending 5 seconds with them. He said it out loud, and the strange girls sitting nearby started whispering to each other, trying to understand what had happened to this unfortunate young man, that he wasn't afraid to tell such things to the whole restaurant. Susie said that it's very brave when a drunk person tells the truth, especially about his illness. Yun Tiny stood up angrily and told everyone be quiet. She offered to forget everything and return Aji home. The woman wanted to protest, but the sight of a drunken man shouting at the whole restaurant about his powerlessness convinced her, and she went after her daughter. Going outside, the girl asked her mother if she really wanted such a chosen one, to which the mother only threw up her hands guiltily. She did not know that everything would be so bad. Suddenly, the girl's phone rang. It was her father calling to tell her that her sister Keikai was back in town. The girl needed to find some nice gifts for the banquet that would be held in honor of her sister's return at her uncle's house. Yun Tani was upset because she didn't know where to get suitable gifts in such a short time. Susie noticed her excitement and offered to take responsibility for the gift because Sister Kai was always friendly to him, and he would be able to find a suitable gift for her by the evening. The mother said that she didn't want to see her uncle's family anymore, and so let them go to the banquet in the evening by themselves. The girl nodded in agreement. With these words, the daughter and mother left. Susie was supposed to come to the banquet in the evening and bring a gift. In the evening, they met at the hotel where the banquet was to be held banquet, and the girl asked her husband to behave decently and not say anything stupid. Susie seriously replied that he was willing to act like this as long as no one provoked him. One of their relatives saw them outside the hotel and approached them. He noticed that they didn't have a present in their hands and laughed that it was a shame to come to his sister without a present. The girl angrily replied that she did not want to discuss it, to which the relative asked to speak with him more respectfully because they still have family ties. He continued that the guy for Keikai was chosen by the chief himself, and it would not be good to come without an expensive gift for this holiday. Just then, Yohu came out with his chosen one, Keikai. The relative immediately happily approached them and shook the guy's hand. Sister Keikai walked up to Suzy and his wife and greeted them. She was very happy to see them and was surprised when the guy handed her a gift from him and his wife. Yu Hui snatched out the gift and looked at it with disgust. He thought that the stone that was in the box was cheap trash, and Yun Tanyi was very upset when she saw his reaction. Kai Kai reassured them that everything was fine and the gift wasn't really important to her. Her chosen one looked angrily at her and was indignant that she was wrong, and sincerity always interferes in life. Su Zhe, after looking at all this, finally took the floor. He said that this stone is real jade and not some kind of garbage. His wife wanted to rebuke him, but he calmed her down with a single glance. The pompous guy Keikai didn't believe him and said that he didn't want him to embarrass himself and therefore advised him to shut up. An elder of the Yun family came up to them, and Yu Hui took out a gemstone from his pocket that was completely different from the one that the couple had given him and said that it was a real Khotan jade. The woman took it and happily said that she didn't have to worry about Kakaya's long as she was around a young director of a large company like Yao Hui, as he would be able to achieve even greater heights. The grandson noticed that this jade was nothing like the ugly stone that Suzy had tried to sell as an expensive gift. There were voices saying the same thing. Suzy couldn't stand it anymore and loudly asked everyone to be quiet while looking at Yao Hui. He reminded everyone how they had given fake gifts to their grandmother last time and how they were not ashamed to make the same mistake. He pointed at the precious jade that Yao Hui had just given him and confidently stated that it was a fake. He stood in front of them, full of confidence, and the crowd fell silent. His grandson wanted to protest, but at the same time, Suzy slapped him hard, causing him to fall to the ground and grab his cheek. The guy said angrily that he wasn't going to lie to anyone like they did to their grandmother. Suddenly, the angry voice of an elderly woman rang out, demanding proof that the gift Yu Hui brought her wasn't real. Relatives began to agree that indeed, The guy could be lucky once, and this is not a reason to constantly use it. Suzy said with a laugh that it was all very easy to prove and recognize the fake. He snatched the jade from the woman's hand and threw it on the ground beside him. The crowd around them cried out in surprise. This was an unheard of audacity. The stone fell to the ground and split into small pieces. Relatives shouted at him that he had ditched a precious stone that was worth hundreds of thousands. Suzy laughed and showed them the broken stone. He explained that the cross-section of the jade indicates that it was made of patina, so it will cost no more than a few $100s. Hui stood to the side, watching this performance, and his fists clenched tighter, and his eyes were bloodshot. The confused woman decided to come to his defense, declaring that it is unlikely that he deliberately deceived her and bought a cheap fake instead of an expensive stone. He just made a mistake and should not be taken seriously. Relatives kept buzzing, discussing what had just happened. Hui bowed in gratitude for his understanding before the elder and looked at Suzy with a victorious gaze. The woman turned angrily to Suzy and declared that it was his fault for ruining this family atmosphere of celebration and welcome. Then she demanded an apology from the guy. Suzy considered his answer, while Hui looked at him mockingly, waiting for more words in his defense. Suddenly, Yuntani, who was watching everything, came forward to defend her husband, saying that he didn't have anything to apologize for, because he didn't do anything wrong and Hui was really wrong. The elderly woman sternly replied that she did not care who was right, who was to blame in this situation, and she demanded an apology to restore the harmony of the family, and the girl should not get involved in this, and even more so to protect someone. Her husband took her hand and led her away, because it was obvious that they were not welcome in this house. The elders shouted after them not to dare leave, but they didn't even look back at her words. Suddenly, old appraiser Zhang appeared at the door. Zhangin greeted the entire family, surprised that they had met again. He reported that he had good news for the Yun family elder. The woman prepared to listen. The old man said that there is a person who is willing to buy the old bowl that Po gave Suzy and offers a huge sum for it. Yun Chani stopped to listen to the conversation. The old woman listened to the news with pleasure and informed the old man that if she was willing to sell these treasures, she would definitely tell him about it. That the old appraiser noticed the nondescript jade in Kaikai's hands, Kaikai snatched it out of her hands in amazement. He stared at it in disbelief, examining it carefully. One of the relatives mockingly reported that this trash was brought by Suzy again, and this time it was definitely something cheap, and that the old man should not waste his time on it. The old man exclaimed that they didn't understand anything and were acting like stupid children. After all, this jade was worn by the royal princess herself a long time ago. Many people may think that this is just a trinket, based only on its appearance, but they will be very much mistaken. This is a very expensive and valuable item. The old appraiser timidly asked who the owner of the item was, and Kaikai pointed at Suzy, who was standing to the side with his wife. The old man approached him and asked him to sell this precious item for 500 million. Everyone gasped, but the guy was not at a loss and advised to ask Kaikai for this question Kaikai, because he had already given her this jade and only she can decide whether to sell it or not. Kaikai was very surprised by his generosity and stood at a loss for what she could say in response. Everyone around her waited tensely for her response. The old man looked at her almost pleadingly, but she shook her head and took the stone from his hands. Kaikai refused to sell the stone to him and smiled. The old man was very upset, but did not show it, only said that it was very insulting for him. He was going to leave this holiday immediately so that he wouldn't have to address this family again. As he passed by Suzy, he asked his name and introduced himself as Yun Chani's husband. The appraiser invited him to visit when there was time, to which the young man evasively replied that if he was free, he would be ready to discuss it. The relatives were outraged by Suzy's arrogance and roared in disapproval. They felt that it was not nice to not accept the old appraiser's invitation, since he was such an influential person in the city. One of the grandsons decided to put an end to this and teach the upstart Suzy lesson. He went into a room and locked himself in there to call one person. Suzy watched him go and realized that he was up to something unkind. He took his wife's hand and asked her to go home, to which she initially agreed. But Kai stopped them and asked them to stay, because they are still one family and can have dinner together. The girl gladly agreed and decided to go back to the holiday. Kai was very happy that her little sister was staying. Finally, all the relatives sat down at the tables and the celebration began. The table began to discuss Yohu's new position because he had recently been appointed director of the Sishui City Land Bureau, Committee Sishui. The man modestly replied that it was not worth paying attention to, but his grandmother praised him that he would achieve a lot, since at the age of 30 he already became the director of a large committee. The man was embarrassed and thanked the woman for her words. Then the relatives thought of Suzy again and asked if he had found a good job. After all, enough time had passed since his return. The guy replied that he hadn't been looking for a job yet, which made everyone at the table laugh a lot. One of his grandsons called him a kept woman because he lived in the Yang family's house and didn't pay any money. Yohui advised him to take a position as a bodyguard or some kind of security guard so that he could provide for his family. But Suzy shook his head and said that he wasn't interested. With that answer, he made everyone else laugh even more because they thought that he wasn't even capable of that. The guy just looked up and didn't say anything. Suddenly there was a crash and the door to the hall flew open, almost flying off its hinges. Everyone jumped up from their seats in fright. Suzy stiffened and grabbed his wife's hand. 3 thugs entered the hall, cursing all around them. They were looking for Suzy, just as that grandson had ordered them to do. They all pointed their fingers at the guy sitting at the table. The bandits came closer to him and asked who he was. Yan Chanyi wanted to call the police, but one of the bandits knocked the phone out of her hand and it fell and shattered. The bandits gave everyone a challenging look, but no one else dared to contradict them. Suzy he sat impassively, as if nothing had happened. The thugs ordered everyone to get out so they wouldn't get hurt, because they only needed this upstart. Everyone immediately jumped up and ran out of the restaurant. The guy asked his wife to leave so that she wouldn't get hurt, but she didn't want to leave. She was training in martial arts and wanted to help him defend himself. Suzy looked at his wife with admiration. This infuriated the leader, and he rushed towards them, shouting obscenities. The mob of bandits followed him. He knew there was going to be a big fight, but he was as ready for battle as ever. No wonder he was considered a dragon marshal. Unfortunately for the thugs, they didn't know about it. Yan Chanyi pressed herself against the table in fright. She hadn't expected such a sudden attack from these bandits, but Suzy was already prepared. He rushed angrily to meet them, full of confidence and determination. With a few punches, he scattered the attackers, and this delighted his wife. Suzy mentioned that he used to be a soldier, so there was nothing to be surprised about. The leader was furious that Suzy was able to hit his guy's back and threatened to break his legs at the first opportunity. The attackers came towards them again after hearing the leader's words and tried to punch the guy in the jaw. The girl screamed and warned Suzy to be careful, to which he nodded and smiled, promising that everything would be fine. He gave these guys a good beating again, not even letting them touch his clothes, and they were again lying on the floor unconscious. Suzy turned to the leader, telling him that his men would not be able to do anything to him this way. They were too weak to harm him. The leader was afraid and said that they were not to blame for this attack. They were well paid, and if he left them alone, they would forget everything that he had done and would not hold grudges. They just wanted to make money with the guys, because everyone works as hard as they can. This made Suzy very angry, and he asked why the leader was threatening him, since they were the ones who started this. The guy hated it when someone dared to threaten him, and he decided to teach the bastard a lesson. The guests outside heard a wild scream from behind the closed door, and Kai was worried about her little sister. She wanted to go in and see if she was okay, but her husband stopped her, mentioning that the bandits had only come for Suzy. The girl tried to look in, but Yohui held her hand tightly and she couldn't move. He angrily said that Suzy should take care of his own problems, because he shouldn't have offended other people. Suzy, meanwhile, had already dealt with the leader and was asking who had sent them here to fight. The big guy told me about his grandson, who promised $100,000 if they'd broke his legs, because he would be very angry with the guy. The girl was very upset that her relative decided to bring such a case against her husband, and Suzy wondered why this guy decided to play foul games to deal with him. The guy offered two options to the leader. Either he breaks the legs of each of them and lets them go, or they themselves go and find that relative, after which they break both of his legs. The bandit nodded fearfully and said that he chose the second option. He hastily gathered his men together and they retreated from the hall. Further down the corridor, the same grandson who had ordered the attack on Suzy was waiting for them. He asked how everything went, and the leader threw his fists at him. Next to him was his father, who picked up his son and yelled furiously at the bandits. In response, they rushed to beat him up as well. The leader ordered his men to break the legs of a relative, to which the relative cried out in horror that he wanted to attack Suzy and not his own death. The leader didn't say anything and said to grab him by the arms and legs. They put the grandson on the floor, and each of the bandits hit his legs hard with a stick. There was a crash, and the boy howled in pain, and his father stood there and could not help. After finishing this, the bandit leader said goodbye to Suzy, took his leave, and left the restaurant. The battered boys trudged after him, and Suzy shouted after them to get lost and never come back here again, much less touch his family. Then he ordered them to lie down on the floor and roll like gingerbread men. The two men looked at each other, but they did as he said, and followed the leader out of the restaurant. The crowd outside watched them go with astonished eyes, wondering what had just happened and why Suzy was still alive. The battered boy's father sat next to him, head bowed. When he saw Suzy enter, he rushed towards him, shouting obscenities furiously and grabbing him by the collar. The angry boy pushed him away and shouted that he should have asked his son first before accusing him of such an act. The father, perplexed, asked his son who had brought these bandits here and for what purpose. An elder of the Yun family appeared at the door and came over to see what had happened. The grandson was sitting on the ground, clutching his leg and whining in pain. Suzy replied that it was just a warning and it would be much worse next time. He also added that if someone wants to attack him or his family again, the price will be high. His grandson glared at him, but said nothing. Suzy gave his wife a hand, and they walked out together. The relatives watched them go, angrily discussing that this upstart didn't think much of their family. The men were talking to each other about how they needed to teach him a lesson, and it wasn't over yet. You can't treat the Yoon family like that. Meanwhile, Suzy and his wife got into the car, and she asked him what had happened to him during the 3 years he had served in the army. But the guy waved off that nothing special had happened, and he would work every day again. Yun Chani was surprised, but didn't say anything. Suzy continued that he took a walk around the area, looked around, and learned some new things. She paused, then thanked him for today, for the gift, for the protection, and everything else. The guy smiled and replied that it was his duty and not worth thanking. They arrived at the Yun family home and were met by Yun Tian's mother and father Yin. They shouted indignantly that he had again caused problems for their family by breaking a relative's leg and setting bandits on him. His parents didn't understand what was happening to him or why he was so aggressive. The girl chimed in and proudly replied that Suzy only fought back after a relative hired the same bandits to destroy them. My mother was furious and said she didn't care and their relative couldn't do that to anyone, so their son-in-law deserved it. The daughter replied that it was all because of the grievance of Yeo Hui, the new director of land and resources in Sishui City, and that was why it looked so bad. Her mother continued to insist that it was not necessary to get involved in this relationship and upset their beloved relatives. They needed to build a relationship so that they could give gifts and participate in the forum tomorrow, but now all is lost. Their family will never get a normal relationship again and will not be able to improve their affairs. The girl sadly said that this is just a forum and there is no need to worry so much. Suzy replied that he would take his wife with him tomorrow and they would show everyone what the Yun family was capable of. My mother replied with disdain that only leaders and business elites were invited to the forum, and they didn't even have invitations. Suzy chuckled and said that don't underestimate him, Neduvsinivet, and he will deal with everything. The girl exhaled wearily and went to bed, complaining of fatigue. Before that, she reassured her parents that tomorrow everything will be fine and they will be able to improve relations without their uncle's family. Her mother shouted that Susie was a bad influence on her, but she didn't hear it anymore. The father took his wife by the hand and asked her not to be angry with the children. Meanwhile, the girl went to the room, telling Suzette that she would cooperate with him. To make parents think that they will go to the forum, they can go to the cafe early and sit there. Susie smiled and said that she didn't trust him either. He went out on the balcony and called his assistants, saying that he would attend the forum tomorrow, but he would need to change his appearance urgently. Tomorrow was going to be an interesting day.